Welcome, my friends, to the Sky's Blue podcast. I'm your host, Jon Enos, and this is episode 2. The theme, the theme of the rap today is Divergence and Purpose. So, last time I told birth stories of the names and a story of birth of my kids. I skipped one and I wrote a note down to tell it this time, and it's more appropriate for the theme or the setup for today's episode. And that was my middle daughter, Taja. Now, all my kids were big birth weight kids, and their mother was a little stick of a ballerina type. And so these were long, difficult, 24-hour labors. And Taja, after this long time, finally came riding out on a wave, crashing into the world, and she went, "Wah!" and then went totally silent and looked around the room somewhat suspiciously. And, being a new dad, this was baby number 2, but, first baby just screamed and cried. And I thought, yeah, that's what they're supposed to do. So this one scream and looking around, I looked at the doctor. I said, is she supposed to do that? Like, is that okay? And he looked up at me and he said, this wise pediatrician, he said, or obstetrician, he said, that's who she is, right? That's her personality. That's who she is. And sure enough, Taj is the one that's going to check out the room, right? We come in with who we are, right? We, the crapshoot of genetics and what happens in gestation is real, man. And the lottery ticket is punched, and we come out into the world with a certain fixed set of personality types and neurology and the way our brain works, the way our bodies work, right? And it's unique to each of us. The challenge is we get born, to use a metaphor, like fish into the ocean, and the water that we're surrounded by is culture, right? It's not a natural environment. It's an environment that's been created by people, by human beings that have come before us, human beings who didn't know us or our needs or our neurology. It's just a system of normalized behaviors that becomes the status quo that everybody else has to conform to and fit in with. But remember, it's an artificial construct, right? To really think this, we need to project back as a mental model, as an exercise, and think about human beings developing on this planet, in this natural world, long before modern cultures began to sprout up like mushrooms. Now, whether you believe that we are placed here by a divine creator, or that the evolutionary process took millions of years, I think we come to the same conclusion. Because what has apparently happened, if it's God, he has used a primate substrate to implant our spirits in, right? Our bodies are flesh, and that those fleshy bodies are constricted to certain patterns of nature of which we are a part, right? Our bodies are based on primates, great apes, right? Our brains have a mammalian part, they have a reptilian part. They have this new part up front, which makes us special. But beyond this new part of our brain up front, which makes us really special, biologically, we aren't that special. We have evolved in the natural world, right? So I want to make a couple points using that as a metaphor about our purpose tonight. You have come in as who you are, but who you are might be broken when put up to the metric of the artificial standards of the culture that we happen to be born into, right? And that's pretty random, Medieval Japan and 20th century America are very different things. And being a man versus being a woman in either of those contexts, very different thing. And being black versus white in either of those contexts, very different thing, right? Again and again and again, this story that keeps going on and on. So we get that crapshoot of who we are, which might be different from who other people are. So different that I might look at the doctor and say, is that all right? for her to be that way, for her to be a kind of person who engages with the world, not with just crying, but one cry and then a look? Like, is it okay? And frankly, who gets to decide? Right? As a digression, we have fallen into the pattern in our culture of thinking we need to drug certain children in order that their behavior will conform to structured school norms that we have invented. Just saying, putting it out there. Don't want to get political, but, I'm concerned about these things as a neurodivergent person who struggled in the education system. And I know others struggle way more than me. But you might be broken based on what society says they need. But I want to reframe that narrative a couple different ways with some examples. So, first of all, if you were, say, an alien, you came to Earth, or heck, even if you're just a human being visiting another country, and you walked into a classroom, heck, even if it was your own country, let's say you walk into a classroom and 30% of the kids had leg braces on. You'd probably wonder, you'd go, wait, is this a special needs class, or what is this, right? I mean, it would call attention to itself. 30% of kids in leg braces is not what we expect. We would be, whoa, that's weird. But if you walk in and you see 30% of the population have eyeglasses on, which is the case, we don't think anything about it. But hang on, that's a problem, right? If 30% of kids in elementary school need corrective lenses, something's wrong, right? Like, that's a breakdown. It's a very high percentage of disability in the eyesight realm. And there's a very good explanation for it. Your eyes, and this may get a little weird, a little scientific, but your eyes are not attached to your brain. Your eyes are your brain. Like, they are the protected in a glass housing nerve endings of a massive structure, the optical nerve, which goes back to a massive system, the visual processing centers of your brain. So if there's any kind of brain injury at all, which can be caused simply by lack of oxygen, if you don't get enough oxygen quite quickly enough. And remember, birth is a really traumatic process, right? Squeezing, and especially if it goes on for a long time. The lack of oxygen just in the birthing process is enough to cause some distributed brain trauma, right? It's an injury to cells in the brain that need oxygen, that didn't get it at a crucial time. Well, just mathematically, the odds are, if that's a random distributed injury in the brain, your largest lobes will get hit. And your largest lobes happen to be your vision processors. So guess what? 30% of us start out life with vision problems, many of which correct over time, right? Because it's not degenerative, it's neurological. Interesting. Later in life, these glasses for me are because of degeneration, right? Age-related and other things, which I'll talk about eventually. So it's interesting to realize that, frankly, most of us have some kind of brain injury as we come into the world. Now, the reason I know all of this stuff is that, as I talked about last week, I've had a brain-injured son for 20 years. One of the first things I did, literally in the hospital in that first 10-day stretch of being there with him, I was looking at the bookshelves behind the counter of the doctor's station, and I saw things like, pediatric disease and, and other things like that. And I was like, ugh. And I just walked around the counter and I was grabbing books and I was reading, Manual of Pediatric Disease and things like that. And I had some nurses say, do you think you should be reading that? And my brain, my neurodivergence, my way of processing emotion, I was like, this is exactly what I need. I need to plunge into an abstract, conceptual, language-based world where I feel safe, right? I can escape these emotions, cramming things into my brain so that the feelings, which are so overwhelming, can be managed. Wow. But what it did is I I did learn a lot of things about neurology. And one of the things I realized is that there's a lot of us who are neurodivergent. What we call normal ain't so normal, ain't so common. A lot of us struggle with neurodivergence. And I also learned about birth trauma for the first time and realized that a lot of us have trauma, even as far back as birth, even if it's not something you remember, an event, a traumatic thing that happened to you, which, happens to most of us as well. You can still carry trauma in your body from birth, from childhood, and not realize it, and have triggers and responses that you're not really aware of. They're just part of your personality, but they're directly related to your nervous system, genetic and learned responses, and the system that is your body-mind complex, because they're not different. The body and the mind, they're the same thing. Your brain is housed in your body. It's one big system, right? And it's complex. We tend to oversimplify this stuff and create these categories that aren't really there in nature. So we all have, or many of us have, neurodivergence, and many of us have trauma. We're only just now coming to a point in our culture where we start to have some language around this. We have labels and things to talk about. And there's still a ton of misunderstanding, but at least we're getting rid of the stigma. I have found, one of the reasons I started this podcast, one of the reasons I've started in my own life with friends, with family, to articulate these things, to talk openly about mental health, is I find it's hugely beneficial. It's therapeutic, not just to me, but to others who hear it, who say, wow, I'm not alone. Because we don't have enough venues, I feel, in our culture, especially for men, to express ourselves, to articulate our pain, our grief, our confusion, right? So we quietly self-medicate and, live lives of quiet desperation, to quote the poet. Man, that's sad. And it's getting harder and harder as the world becomes more and more unstable, and more pressure cooker, and more unpredictable, which causes anxiety because you can't plan for the future, right? So stress is going up. I think everyone out there, broadly speaking, is under levels of stress and trauma and trigger that they don't even realize. And I think so much of the divisions, particularly in our country, but globally as well, are due to this, the sheer animal-based stress that we have put ourselves under in this modern world without even realizing it. The Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying, evolutionary biologists who have their own podcast called the Dark Horse Podcast, have written a book called, I believe it's a field guide to the 21st century, something like that. And they have the term hyper-novelty, which is just that we have hyper-accelerated how quickly things change. Electric lights, chemicals in our food, different stresses, changing time zones all the time. These digital interfaces which our brains have not adapted to and are causing all kinds of issues, et cetera, et cetera. The challenge is not that we have one or two categories of hyper-novelty. The challenge is we have a dozen stacked categories of hyper-novelty, and they're all coalescing at the same time and sort of driving us all a little crazy. In this case, not being disrespectful, but saying this is an understandable thing and something we need to engage with consciously and proactively and talk about openly and need to be no stigma about. We're all suffering. If healing is the objective, I think some form of self-transparency is probably necessary. Now, I want to predicate this ongoing project of the podcast, which will follow different rivers and themes and tributaries as time goes on. But I want to ground it in a couple major conceptions. We're all facing some kind of trauma in our life, and I think broadly speaking, this is at the root of a lot of our social ills, is mental health. But this can be engaged with, and it can be, I don't want to use dramatic words like cured, fixed, etc., because there's so many problems around those words. They're so loaded. We have to be able to come up with a language to say, you are perfect the way you are, and There are tips and tricks and biohacks and techniques and possibly medications and therapies and other things that if you are interested in engaging with can maximize, make life even better, right? That's the delicate balance I'm treading. Because I really do want to say, you are perfect the way you are. Here's my digression, my argument for that. In evolutionary theory, if something is not actually beneficial to the individual or the whole, it'll get weeded out, right? Broadly speaking, that's the concept behind it, right? It's not that God isn't involved. God could easily have structured it this way, right? That nature just uses a pattern of experimenting. If it's working, okay. If it has some survival benefit, it leaves it in the system. If it has no survival benefit, it probably means you're not going to pass it along to the next generation because you didn't survive, right? So it gets weeded out. So if there's a tendency in society, and if it's still there, and if it's still present at a relatively high concentration, even if it's a minority, it might be important. And it might be there for a reason, for an evolutionary reason. For example, here's my hypothesis about night owls. Now, I used to be a night owl. I have a theory that certain neurodivergences at the genetic level are associated with one another. For example, in dogs, if you're going to domesticate dogs, what they found is that the physical traits of the dog that are most considered juvenile traits, the floppy ears, the curly tail, the things that make them look cute and puppyish but not adultish, those physical characteristics seem to be linked to the genes for domesticatability, being more domesticatable, being more comfortable around humans, being able to read human facial communication better, which domesticated dogs can do and wolves can't, for example. All of those traits, which make them good as house pets through natural selection, also make them more juvenile. Those traits are linked. It's interesting. And it's so much so that there was this Russian experiment where they tried to domesticate foxes, wild foxes, and they thought, wouldn't it be great if these gorgeous bushy-tailed creatures could come into our homes and be our pets? And it took them 40 generations of selective breeding, and by the time they got them domesticated, they didn't look like foxes anymore. They looked like puppy dogs, right? They had changed. They had morphed. The physical characteristics of the personality trait was attached to the physical characteristics of the juvenile body type. So my theory is, I'm extrapolating from that observation to humans. My theory is that certain traits get linked. And so this is why we have the trope of the crazy artist, the Van Gogh cutting off his ear, or, alcoholism, Pollock, driving off a cliff because he was drunk, or what, all these terrible things among artists. This is well known. This is a trope. And I've seen it myself, that the vast majority of artists seem to be neurodivergent in a broad category of ways. And there's a broad similarity of this. As will be revealed slowly over time as these stories broaden and get deeper, I will describe that I have grown up. I'm living a very small, hermitish life right now, but I've grown up in the entertainment industry, and I have family that is deeply connected, involved, names you will know. And I've been around fame and performers and talented people my whole life, and so many of them. And I hope eventually to begin bringing them onto the show in interview context so they could tell you this themselves. But so many of them are neurodivergent, either have crippling self-doubt or shyness or fear or other anxieties, or, just, it's intense how many. I think they're linked somehow. And across other disciplines as well. I think scientific creativity, vision, is very often linked with neurodivergence. And tech genius definitely is. So, for example, I heard a story I believe the story was by Thomas Friedman, author, and I think he's a historian and economist. But anyway, if it was him, he tells a story. He said he was invited to give a lecture at some big place, either Google or Apple or one of the big tech guys, to their big management, upper management. He said, they're very interested in what you have to say. But we want to let you know that you may feel odd when you go into the lecture hall. Very few of them will be looking at you. They will be looking down at their screens and engaging you. We guarantee you they're listening to you, they're enjoying you, and if they want to interact, they will. Some by email, some by, right? They're there. They're not, they are paying attention to you, but they can't make eye contact. It's just not, they're very uncomfortable, and so they'd rather do it on the screen. So he was like, what? He looked into this. It turns out that a very high percentage of the tech geniuses, the ones who think in code, are Asperger's syndrome, which is like a high-functioning autistic. It literally causes them pain to be looking into the face of another human being. But through a screen, they can do it. So guess what? They created a world where now we're all staring at screens. It's interesting. Their neurodivergence is actually steering the course of society. But what I want to point out is a positive thing. I mean, it's complex, right? It's complex. But the positive is that these neurodivergent people who have real social anxiety and some real handicaps in certain ways of engaging are terrifically good at things we think are pretty cool, right? Here's another example. Richard Feynman, who was a physicist, Nobel laureate in physics, worked on the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. He wins a Nobel Prize, and at some point in his career, and I should have looked up the details. I've forgotten. I read a biography of him years ago, and I forget the details. But so I'm just broadly sketching an example from his life. He decides to take a sabbatical year off and go study a different discipline just to cleanse his palate from physics. He's a little stressed out by the bomb, I think. So he goes over to biology, and he makes the plans, makes the arrangements, and he joins this lab that has this ongoing experiment, and he's given these things, and he says, all right, look at these slides and make your observations, whatever. And he's like, okay, go. And he comes in fresh. You know, he's a trained scientist, but not in biology. Within almost no time at all, he notices something in their experiment that has been there the whole time that they have not seen. And he goes, what's this? And what he has seen triggers a light bulb that triggers a discovery that wins them another Nobel Prize. He's one of the only people, I think, I should have looked that up too, but he's one of the very few people who have won 2 Nobel Prizes in 2 completely different disciplines. And the second one was not his discipline at all. He just saw something other people didn't see. His way of seeing simply was of benefit at that time. So back to the night owl thing. I think night owlism goes with creativity, which goes with a little bit of crazy. No disrespect in using that word. I'm being comical. Here's the thing. What if the night owls were essential back when we lived as tribal families under our big huts around the campfire in the wild nature, right? The night owls were the guards. And then eventually we domesticated dogs so that they would help us be our guards too. And it all worked out, right? But we needed both domesticated dogs and night owls to be our guards. And then they go to sleep and the rest of us go out and hunt and fish and farm, right? And, you know, and some people are taking care of babies while other people with other talents are doing other things. That's the theory, the utopian way of looking at a tribal economy. It's a distribution of skills and tendencies as well as labor, right? The point I'm making is that you were born this way, the way you are, for a reason. Your neurodivergence is still in the system because you contribute to society as a whole and to the individuals. There's an odd chance that the way you are is essential for us seeing a way through something, even if it's just to laugh in the moment and diffuse an argument into a thing of forgiveness. I'm going to talk briefly about purpose. You know, I've been making the case that your neurodivergence has a purpose, but back to this duality where there are tips and tricks that you can use to improve on some of the traits that your neurodivergence may give you that may be a problem for you, if any. For example, my OCD is sometimes a problem for me, and I need to engage with it in a way that I take control of it to a certain extent. And so I'm perfect the way I am, but also I don't want to be ruled by that tendency. I want to take charge of it as much as possible. That's what I desire. Luckily, there are ways to do that. And I have tried some of them that have worked, which we can talk about in a separate thing. I'm just saying conceptually, we need to come to a place where we can say, I can take charge of my neurodivergence if I need to. There are techniques, there are ways to soothe and heal neurological trauma that's in the body that will make all your systems work better so that you're better able to contribute to society. But guess what? If you are never able to quote unquote contribute to society, it's okay. You are perfect the way you are. You know, my son Aryan lay there in a bed, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to feed himself, unable to clean himself, unable to communicate, mostly blind, pretty good hearing, extremely limited motor control, and he had laid there for 20 years. But I'm going to provide to you a compelling case that he fulfilled an astonishing purpose, that his presence in the world had a dramatic impact on many people, pushing them in a desire to go in a way that bettered them and bettered their presence in their own families and communities, which betters the world. He bettered the world. It was a lot of work, but he had purpose. You have purpose just laying there, doing nothing. You don't need to check a box that somebody else invented in order to feel like you have achieved your purpose. Your purpose is achieved the moment you flower into being. We're going to walk the fine line on this show to explore both of those essential paradoxes. You are both broken and beautiful. You are both perfect and you can improve and take charge and change your behavior and change your neurology and have more joy in your life if you feel you need it. But also to tell all of you that are sensing a feeling of hopelessness or feeling of lack of achievement or no, my loves, no. God didn't design it to be as hard as human culture has made it. Can we agree on that? The natural order is not as hard on us as the world we have found ourselves born into, okay? We need to make some changes. I think we can agree on that. But within that context, going there, you're great, man. Don't worry about it. Quit beating yourself up as part of the problem. You've got other traumas you need to deal with. Quit re-inflicting new traumas on yourself with this punishment stick, that we give ourselves. And I'm talking to myself, my friends. I'm not talking to you. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a doctor. I'm not giving advice. I am just telling stories of my own life in hopes that they can help you. My friends, stay hopeful. I'm gonna end here. There's a lot to unpack, but we have time. We'll talk to you next week. I love you. Ciao.